So hi, I'm Lindsay, and in today's video, I'm going to be talking about frame rates, and in particular, what frame rates are and how to use them in different situations to create different effects. So if you're curious about frame rates and want to know more about them, especially if you're a beginner at videography, definitely keep watching this video. So hi, I'm Lindsay and welcome to my channel, LaVida Media. And on this channel, it's my goal to help you shorten your learning curve with videography and YouTube, and to help you figure out how to use your camera faster without complicated videos. So if that sounds like something you're interested in, definitely subscribe to my channel below. If you have a question, leave it in the comments. Let's get into the video. So in today's video, I'm going to break it down when it comes to frame rates. What are frame rates and which frame rate you should use for which situation. But my first question is, have you ever wondered why, if you're watching like a soap opera or old camcorder footage or a movie or the news, and just wondered why the movements felt different? It just felt like there was a different visual effect, but you didn't know what it was. It actually all comes down to frame rates. Frame rates help give the movement in videos a certain feel. For example, it might give more natural movement, or it might give more realistic or exaggerated movement. So in today's video, I'm going to cut it into two parts. The first part is going to be about what are frame rates, and part two is going to be which situations you would use which frame rates. Okay, so let's get into part one. So a lot of times when people first get a new camera and they're going through the settings and they come across frame rates, and they get different choices, they often make the mistake of assuming that the highest number is always going to be the highest resolution. And in some situations, such as resolution, that would be true. But when it comes to frame rates, it's not like that at all. Higher frame rates do not equal higher resolution. And in fact, resolution and frame rates are two completely different settings that have really nothing to do with one another. They're just separate settings that create different effects. So when it comes to frame rates are actually the number of pictures your camera takes every single second. So for example, if you're filming at 24 frames per second, that means your camera is taking 24 individual pictures every single second. Or if you're shooting at 60 frames per second, your camera is taking 60 pictures per second. Now, which one do you think is going to record more information and more movement? Obviously, the higher frame rate, the 60 frames per second. And a lot of times when people get a new camera and they see 24, 30, 60, or even 120 frames per second, they think, oh, let me shoot at 60 or 120 frames per second, thinking it's going to be the highest definition for their camera. But when in reality, that's actually the frame rate, and different frame rates have different uses. And if you film at 60 or 120 frames per second, it's going to create a different kind of motion blur than you're probably expecting. So now that we covered what a frame rate is, it's the number of pictures per second. On your camera, you're going to see 24, 30, and 60. Typically, those are the main ones. Some higher end cameras might go to 120 or even higher. And typically, the most natural frame rate for the human eye is 24 frames per second. And it's also what we're most used to seeing because this is what is shown in movies. Movies are filmed in 24 frames per second. Then you have 30 frames per second, which is typically more used in news broadcasts or in soap operas. A lot of people, when they get into videography and they don't really understand frame rates, they automatically assume that 60 frames per second is the highest def frames per second, which, like I said earlier, it has nothing to do with high definition. And also I see a lot of YouTubers, especially new YouTubers, filming in 60 frames per second, like their vlogs or sit down talking videos. And I think it's also because they are assuming that 60 frames per second is the highest def resolution, which, like I said, has nothing to do with resolution. The most common use of 60 frames per second for videographers is to create slow motion later when you're editing the video. Cameras with 60 frames per second or even 120 frames per second create really beautiful slow motion that's not jittery, and when you're in when you're using the editing software. For example, if you're using something like Adobe Premiere or Final Cut Pro, in the software they have the ability to take the 60 frames per second and take out some of the frames to create some creamy slow motion. And that's typically what videographers use 60 frames per second for, is they reserve it strictly for creating slow motion in editing. So in this clip right here, I wanted to show you kind of what it looks like to be recording in 60 frames per second. And you can feel that it has a lot of motion, but there's not a lot of blur. And, you know, some people like it, some people don't. But in this situation, I like to slow it down to look something else like this. Now you can see this is the exact same footage, but it's slowed down to 60 frames, to 24 frames per second. So I removed over 40, I think 46 different frames. Yeah, and you can see now that it's much slower and a lot creamier, and it's very smooth slow motion. So that's the situation when I like to use 60 frames per second. I record it in 60 frames per second, and then in editing, I change it to 24 frames per second, and it creates slow motion. If that's really confusing to you, I understand. It was when I first started. If you have any questions along the way, definitely put them in the description, into the comments, and I will help you with that. But in general, if you're getting into videography, think of 60 frames per second as something that's reserved for slow motion in your videos. If you're doing YouTube, you might be speaking in 24 frames per second to the camera, but when you go out to or even in your house somewhere to record B-roll, and you want slow motion B-roll like you see certain YouTubers using, you would record that in 60 frames per second. And when you import that footage into your editing software, you have an option to change from 60 frames per second to 24 frames per second, and that's how you create slow motion. Now, if you record video in 24 frames per second and try later to turn this into slow motion, it doesn't work because there's not enough pictures taken in the frames per second. In 60 frames per second, there's lots of pictures taken, there's 60. But in 24 frames per second, there's only 24 frames. And in 60 frames per second, you can take out a lot of frames and make it nice slow motion. But in 24 frames per second, there's only 24 frames, so if you took out half of those frames to make slow motion, it would just look really jittery. I know that might be confusing as well, but think for a second if you've ever recorded something with your phone, and when you went back to make it slow motion, it looked a little jittery. It's because you're probably recording in probably 30 frames per second, and when you made it into slow motion, it took out frames, but there wasn't enough frames to make it look nice and smooth, so it started to look really jittery. But actually, there is a setting on some smartphones, especially iPhones, the newer iPhones, that you can set your phone to record in 60 frames per second. Typically, it's set in 30 frames per second, but you can set it in 60 frames per second to create slow motion with your iPhone or smartphone. And that's another thing. Typically, when I'm recording with my Sony a6400, I always record the talking part of the video, like this part of the video, in 24 frames per second. But let's say if I make a video with my phone, which occasionally I do out of convenience, there's no 24, I don't think there's a 24 frames per second unless you download a special app. But usually the default for iPhones is 30 frames per second. Or you can pick 60 frames per second, but the talking one, it's always 30 frames per second. So that's what I record my videos with my iPhone, is in 30 frames per second. And it's fine. I just like to use 24 frames per second when I have the option on my camera. So let me know in the comments which frame rates you like to use for your situation or what you're filming. And if you have a question about frame rates, definitely don't hesitate to write it below. I try to get to all the questions and comments I can get to. And yeah, if you enjoyed this video and found it helpful, definitely please give me a thumbs up. Don't forget to subscribe for more videos and check out some of these videos over here. And that's it, I guess. I'll see you in the next video.